you for that lovely introduction. I thought I would go ahead and pass the book around, just so you can see it, and because Chicago did such a beautiful job with the cover. So my book is really best described as an attempt to trace the demise of the 19th century ideology of moral motherhood, or the cult of domesticity, and an analysis of what emerged in its wake. And as many of you know, in the field of U.S. women's history, much attention has been paid to the rise of this ideology and the central role that it played in the emergence of a new middle class, particularly in the urban north. The home, governed by the moral mother, or the angel of the house, came to be imagined as the repository of all those virtues that seemed endangered by the rise of partisan politics and rapid economic transformation. And there's a really rich body of scholarship by Mary Ryan, Nancy Cott, Ruth Bloch, Jan Lewis, Amy Kaplan, many others, that traces the rise of this ideal of true womanhood or moral motherhood and explores its class dimensions, its racial dimensions, and analyzes its relationship to political and economic realms. But I came to feel that we had a less clear understanding of the moral mother's downfall, of how, when, and why many Americans came to reject some of the basic precepts that had defined the Victorian ideal of motherhood. So I thought just very briefly, what were these precepts, at least the ones that I address in the book. I identified 4 central components of this ideology, and then discussed how these assumptions were challenged or modified in the 20th century. And it should be obvious, these are principles or ideals rather than social realities. So first, this idea that mother love was the purest of human emotions and essential to the formation of the modern self. Victorians spoke very effusively about mother love as a force that virtually bordered on the divine. They believed that mothers should forge emotionally intense relationships with their children, binding them with silver cords of love to keep them on the path of virtue. And mother love was deemed, of course, especially critical for boys, since they would ultimately be venturing out into the corrupt world where they would confront its very temptations. So the way, really, to raise an upright and moral man was to have him internalize the voice of the moral mother as his conscience. And basically what this allowed for, or it really encouraged, was a style of mothering that today would seem both overly intrusive and really kind of downright manipulative. So second, motherhood entailed physical suffering and the willingness to risk one's life for another. And throughout the 19th century and really well into the 20th century, Americans spoke of childbirth as a perilous time when women went down into the valley of the shadow of death to give life. In turn, because motherhood involved such risk, suffering, and sacrifice, children incurred a lifelong debt to their mothers that could never be repaid. And this was very explicit. So third, the mother homemaker role was a full-time, lifelong role, incompatible with the demands of wage earning outside the home. And although we know that, of course, this is not true for working class women, women of color, that this was in any way a social reality. We also know that even middle class women were often contributing to the family income in important ways, but this ideology really created a very strict division between the corrupt commercial world and the private, non-commercial world of the home, where women's values were allowed to thrive. So in the early early 20th century, progressive maternalists, women's advocates sort of tried to use this ideology to argue in favor of mothers' or widows' pensions, arguing that in the absence of a male breadwinner, the state should support the mother so that she could continue to care for her own children in her own home. Again, the reality played out very differently, but that ideology was used in that fashion. So, and then finally, motherhood was not simply a private familial role, but also a social and civic one. And you see this in the language of the times in the late 19th century and early 20th century. People frequently spoke of the institution of motherhood, almost as if it were a fourth branch of government, or referred to the beneficial powers of organized womanhood. And according to this conception, the male counterpart to the mother is not the father, but the soldier who is willing to, sacrifice his well-being for the greater good of the whole. Okay, so in my book, I try to show how these ideas came under severe attack in the 1920s and in this kind of ongoing process. I really see this as cresting in the post-World War II period. That American culture gradually ceased to represent motherhood as an all-encompassing identity rooted in notions of self-sacrifice and infused with certain social and political meaning. Instead, in the post-World War II years, mainstream culture depicted motherhood more narrowly as a private and deeply fulfilling experience and a single, albeit still central, component of a more multifaceted female identity. So really the roots of what we have today, I would argue. So my narrative focuses on the shifting idea of the so-called all-American mother and the middle-class white women who had both the material resources and the demographic profile that made these ideals at least a somewhat realistic aspiration. And I see the book as attempting several interrelated tasks. First, and probably most straightforwardly, I argue that this ideology of moral motherhood persisted longer than we've often thought. There seems to be some assumptions that with the rise of modernity in the early 20th century, the rise of scientific motherhood, a lot of these more sentimental notions kind of drifted away or receded naturally. And I argue that they actually persisted well into the interwar period and were the subject of a very vigorous assault. So I call attention to this strain of anti-maternalism, what I call anti-maternalist sentiment in American culture, and I try to show how anti-maternalist critiques transformed the dominant paradigm, maternal paradigm, and paved the way for a new post-war model that I describe as this natural motherhood, exemplified by Benjamin Spock, for example. And this ideal, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time today, but I go into more detail in the book, involved both a rejection of Victorian motherhood and also a rejection of the sort of scientific motherhood of being very rigid in your approach to child rearing, schedules, and all of that. So, so what I try to show is ultimately how that new ideal both reflected and facilitated white, middle-class women's gradual incorporation into the political and economic order as individuals rather than as wives or mothers. And so to put it very starkly, I argue that this older maternalist paradigm that thrived in the early 20th century and persisted in the interwar period was largely dismantled by a very diverse group of critics who attacked it for different and competing reasons. So that included feminists who rejected maternalism as stifling and moralistic, anti-feminists who resented the privileges that women continued to claim as mothers and moral arbiters even as they gained new rights, and social scientists and psychological experts who sought to expand their expertise into various realms.